Well, I'm glad that we had the good news presentation first, and now we're going to talk about climate change. If I can get the slides to work. Yep. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. In this particular case, I'm from Tasmania, and I certainly wish to acknowledge the elders in Tasmania as well as the elders here, and elders past, present, and emerging. Often when I speak of climate change, I start with this map. And the importance of the map is twofold. Firstly, it puts us at the centre. I'm so sick and tired of world maps where we're way over here in the right-hand corner down below. We're not. We're at the centre of the world, and we're certainly at the centre of our world. And often when I'm overseas and discussing these kinds of issues, I say I'm from the end of the world to talk about the end of the world. But hopefully we can prepare and not make it the end of the world. But really, we're on the cusp of profound change that we've never seen in the history of humanity. And we can go to sort of the kinds of factors that are leading to climate change and global warming, anthropocentric causes such as how we produce food, deforestation, of course, the fossil fuel industries and so on. But at the end of the day, that kind of description belies the key causes of the crisis that we face today, and that is the climate crimes of the powerful. This is probably the most important slide if I was going to talk about the necessity for social transformation. But my brief today is not to talk about revolutionary change and social transformation. It's to talk about the climate change challenges for criminal justice. But this is the backdrop. And this backdrop is fundamental to understanding the genesis of the problem and indeed how we address the underlying causes of the problem. And the consequences are grave. And what I'm going to do today is present a kaleidoscope. So I'm not going to necessarily read all the slides, and I'm assuming that the slides will be available for whomever wishes. Potentially, this will be written up as a trends and issues paper, but basically the gravity of the issue is such that it's smacking us in the face as we speak. And it's not future, it is now. And we are so woefully unprepared. And it's accelerating. This has all happened literally within the last couple of weeks, right? So we have the information about what's happened in September. We are setting records globally, and it's accelerating. So we can talk about the causes of climate change and global heating. We can talk about the consequences, but we have to acknowledge that it's accelerating. It is speeding up. And this has massive implications for all of us in this room. All of us as civilians, all of us as parents, all of us as workers. And obviously, we're going to see compounding problems and risks. This is referred to by Clifford Shearing and others as a new harmscape. It's an amalgamation of a whole range of different kinds of risks and harms. And initially, when people talked about harmscape and the changing climate change landscape, they talked about short-term, long-term, and medium-term, and so on. But it's collapsing. Time is collapsing. So that basically we're confronted today with stuff that we were anticipating would happen in a decade from now. So we have no time to lose. One of the areas of research that we need is to look more closely at climate-related crimes. As a criminologist, I've looked at various aspects of this, looking at the kinds of crimes that contribute to climate change. We can look at climate change affecting existing categories of crime. And again, I'm not going to read the slide in full, but then we can also talk about new crimes and crossover crimes associated with crimes affecting the environment and climate change. We heard earlier about water theft and organized crime groups moving into the area of water and controlling water, freshwater resources, not simply in places like Kenya, but this is going to be a worldwide trend. We need water, it's essential to life. Scarcity breeds criminality, basically. And as things worsen, we're going to see more organized criminal pursuit in areas relating to our natural resources, our food production, and so on. So that's still backdrop because we haven't got to us. And us is basically the criminal justice institutions and agencies. But what are we actually confronting? We're not simply confronting this abstract thing called climate change, but we're confronting different kinds of crimes, intensification of crimes. We've got the conventional crimes still occurring. We've got new crimes being added on into the whole suite of criminality and crimes. Then we have events that we have to respond to because who else is going to respond? We are the first responders. So we have to respond. And that poses massive challenges for our allied services. But these also contribute to longer-term problems. We know that there are people in Lismore who still don't have a place to stay. They're living in tents a year after the event. So we have this intersection of crimes, events, and problems, and it's going to cause us grief unless we intervene. So what are the implications for criminal justice? Again, I'm not going to read the slides, but basically one of the key changes in the area of regulation and law enforcement is a pluralization of roles. Actually, I was thinking here with the question that was asked about recruitment and so on, it's very interesting that the Australian Defence Force put out 2 weeks ago, or in the last couple of weeks, a report saying, we're not sure what's going on with us because our mission is changing because we're spending so much resources into, they call humanitarian exercises, that basically we're not sure about the external threats to the country because we have to put more resources into dealing with natural disasters within Australia. That's what they're saying in the report. Then turn on the telly and look at the ads for the ADF. And it's the evacuation of Malakuta. So it's the Navy, it's the ships going in, it's evacuating, and at front and center of the ad is a female officer, right? So it's virtually some of that stuff you were saying before. It's inclusiveness, it's humanitarian, it's disaster relief, it's a beneficial thing. We're not killing people, we're actually saving people. So the narrative of the ad, in a sense, contradicts the statements in the formal reports. But this is the kind of mission creep that's occurring everywhere, particularly for police. The pluralization of policing. It's no longer simply about crime fighting and enforcement of law and so on, but basically it's moving more and more into the area of disaster and emergency management. And if you look at the climate reports, every report, the IPCC reports, the World Meteorological Organization reports, they're saying that the number of disasters is going to increase and the intensity is going to increase. So that's going to put even more stress on the existing capacity of our first responders. And our first responders include state emergency services, the police, the AMBOs, the fireys, and then we can add to that other layers, the insurance adjusters, and so on and so on. Multiple roles require greater specialization, as well as generalist capacity building. We're going to see an increase in trauma-related issues. We already know, for example, in the area of policing, that trauma-related well-being and care is a major issue, just in the normal course of operational duties. Then you stir into that mix disasters of floods and fires and storms and so on, and this is something that's going to add to the woes, not diminish them. We also have to talk about a community social license in terms of we're allowing those who are destroying the environment to continue their work, even in the midst of arresting those who are protesting that exercise. We've also heard the importance of interagency collaboration. And of course, this notion, I've just come across this concept recently, temporal exhaustion. So damn busy doing stuff that we're tired. So how the hell can we be thinking about new stuff and preparation for new stuff? So the first slide, when I go through this, is basically saying, here's the problems. And the second slide is basically, here's what we need to do. And again, I'm not going to, this is a kaleidoscope, a smorgasbord of ideas. It's to generate discussion, some thinking, further thinking. These aren't all the answers at all, but basically we do have to work with civil society and NGOs in the climate change space. We have to talk seriously about equipment and technological requirements if you're going to talk about dealing with disasters and emergency management. Something as simple as a uniform. As temperatures heat up, we have to have uniforms that are suitable to the particular climates that we're engaged, that we're living in and working in. The special equipment as first responders. The list goes on. Information management systems is a very big thing in terms of not only responding in terms of climate-related crimes, including organized crime, but also information management in relation to prediction and sussing out where we need to put personnel and where we need to put people, projecting into where the disasters are going to occur and so on. Obviously, a multi-agency, multidisciplinary task force on a permanent basis around climate change. We need to develop climate literacy and strategic preparedness. And of course, greening justice. Let's go with foot patrols and bicycles. But we have to take seriously that mandate of decarbonization. And then we can look to what's happening in law and courts as another facet of criminal justice. Here we can see the current trends around climate change litigation. Again, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Often it's directed against governments and government policy, but it's also increasingly being used against private companies, commercial enterprises. There's been a number of calls for the new crime of ecocide to be introduced and embedded in legislation. The European Union has gone so far as to actually now has a working body, a working group that's actually trying to figure out a way to embed it within the European Union. So it's not simply speculation, it's not simply the Stop Ecocide movement, but it's actual administrations, collective governments and specific national governments who are thinking about embedding and putting in place the crime of ecocide. There's novel defenses being used in courts that we have to take into account, so the courts are being challenged to think of activist action and the defense of the necessity to act, which in the light of IPCC and the World Meteorological Organization facts and stats and statistics basically is saying we do have a necessity to act. People engaging in desperate behavior in the defense of duress. There's court cases going on about disinformation, misinformation, and of course court infrastructure and the changing infrastructure of the courts themselves as part of decarbonization. So problems or issues, and then we can go to what are some of the responses. Redefining legal and social obligation. Developing greater specialist expertise. I, for many years, have been a fan of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court. It's been going for over 40 years. They developed an ecocentric approach to dealing with these issues. They have metrics that they use in discerning what is the nature and quantum of environmental harm. They can translate that into adjudication in terms of what kind of penalties to assign to people and so on. Climate literacy for staff across the administrative, civil, and criminal proceedings. Emergency measures. We need courts in the countryside because as stuff happens and if there's climate-related crimes, then we need mobile courts. So we have to be prepared for that as well. And of course, greening justice. If we go to crime prevention, I mentioned earlier that we have crimes, we have events, we have problems, and we've got to figure out a way to address that intersection and that notion of harmscape. But if you accept that the harmscape is complicated and includes these kinds of elements, then how do we respond? How do we define climate victims? There's a lot of stuff at the moment on the rights of nature. So rivers and mountains, there's stuff on non-human species. So victimhood is not simply about humans, but it includes non-human entities as well. The securitization of natural resources to the advantage of the advantaged. I'm thinking here of water for irrigation. Think here of the Murray-Darling, and we want to protect those who have bought the water licenses because water's been commodified. Well, that's going to put a lot of noses out of joint in periods of drought where you get the local family farmers saying, oh, hang on, you're taking all the water, but our survival depends upon this water. So social conflicts over resources. We need to be, in fact, really sensitive to local contexts. A climate-related crime could be seen as looting, but looting is nuanced. If there's been fire and flood, and you need water and food, and your house has been swept away, then you're going to have to go somewhere where you can get water and food. Is that looting? Or is that survival? So there's a nuance to all this as well. And of course, the elephant in the room, the policing of civil society resistance around climate justice issues. So the anti-protest laws, non-violent demonstrations and actions, and how do we respond to that? Because if you want to recruit to the various agencies, then this is front and center for a number of people. Rather than crime prevention, the response I've called harm prevention. So again, we have to deal with environmental victims and expanding what we consider to be environmental victims. We need precautionary measures, contingency plans, and so on. And that includes communication systems. One of the first things that can go often in these disasters and calamities is your communication systems. And who you're going to communicate with and how you're going to communicate. This takes us back to that issue of equipment as well, by the way. Evacuation strategies, including prisons, nursing homes, escape routes. What we found recently in Tasmania, there was a fire and there was only one way in and one way out. So people got trapped inside the disaster zone, but fortunately it turned out okay. In the case of Maui in Hawaii, the escape routes got congested because there were so many vehicles, and they got so congested that nobody could move. So this is the kind of forward planning that we need today. Heat-related responses in terms of harm prevention. We know, and again, this is a kaleidoscope of stuff. Underneath all of this is a lot more literature. So we know there's a relationship apparently between temperatures, changes in temperatures, especially hot temperatures, and aggression and violence. So a harm prevention measure is to have cooling stations, or if you have bus shelters, have the cooling mists. Now we do have that in some places, in some cities, but it's one of the things that we have to think of. And of course, community environmental action. If we go to corrections, we have to look at the conditions inside our prisons from the point of view of health and safety, the temperature extremes, questions of ventilation. We know already from various studies that prisons around the country have said that the prison's too damn hot. There is no air conditioning in a number of prisons. The ventilation's poor and hot during periods of heat waves and so on. And basically, people are suffering. These are our brothers and sisters, our sons and daughters, and they're suffering because of the poor conditions. And it opens the door for human rights violations and legal action around cruel and unusual punishment and so on. And again, if there is a connection between increased temperatures and aggression, then we can suppose that there will be increased levels of violence where people are under stress, under heat stress within the prison. And that's without even considering correctional officers, because they're in the hot place as well. We can talk about the increased financial burdens to reform institutions, so the modifications that are needed. Prisoner evacuation is a major issue. There was an event recently in Australia where the prisoners weren't evacuated. The local townspeople were, but the prisoners weren't. And that raises a whole host of questions. And again, prisoners with illness or disability or age-related fragilities, we have to again do some planning around that as well. Prisoner labor. certainly in overseas jurisdictions, there's cases where they've been dragooned into doing sandbagging and fighting fires, but just dragooned like that, right? With no training, with poor equipment and so on. So there are issues here in terms of corrections. And again, there's stuff that we can do and that we need to do. So modification of existing infrastructure, the introduction of, if we don't have them already, of national temperature standards. We need national preventive mechanisms through the OPCAT, Optional Protocol on the Convention Against Torture in Tasmania, and I think one other jurisdiction. We have some legislation in place where we have a national preventive mechanism where we have people go in and make sure that conditions are in fact satisfactory. But we need accountability in our prison systems. Prison officer training, again, as with across the board, with policing and regulatory personnel, with court personnel and so on, we need climate literacy. We need disaster and emergency management procedures in relation to evacuations, particularly from prisons. The greening of prisons, recycling prison farms and so on. And prison labour we have to look at very carefully. It's a very complicated issue and there's a lot of issues wrapped around that. Is it voluntary? Is it going to be forced? What about health and safety? What about the trauma-related aftercare for people who have been traumatised? Well, actually volunteered to go and fighting a fire or working in the flood area. What kind of equipment are prisoners going to get? What about the post-prison credentials? There was a case in the United States, I think in California, where something like a third of the firefighting workforce is prisoners. But when you graduate from prison, the fire services weren't hiring you because you've been in prison. Right? So you've got the experience and you're relied upon, in fact, heavily relied upon by the government to fight fires, but when you leave, you didn't have the credentials and nobody would hire you because of your prison record. So there are new mandates, procedures and processes, and again, I'm not going to read the slides, but they're fairly self-explanatory. We need a capacity to pivot quickly. We need agile policy. We have to engage in climate-affected practice in terms of education and training at the foremost, really. But we also have to deal with questions like exhaustion and exposure to trauma, harm prevention as a priority, and so on. There's a number of victim-related issues. I've mentioned non-human victims. So who counts humans, non-human victims, non-human animals? But also, what are our evacuation strategies? Nursing homes. So it's prisons, yes, but nursing homes and other areas where we have vulnerable population groups. Victim support, so health, food, accommodation, and disaster victim identification, and integrate disaster victim identification into the domestic context, obviously with the forensics teams and a range of forensics experts. But this is something that we have to be prepared for. Something like 20,000 people recently, in a sense, disappeared in Libya, and because of the floods. That's a huge ask in terms of disaster victim identification. We had the earthquakes in Morocco. We have to ask here, as things speed up and so many things start to happen, we do have to have the scientists, the experts, the first responders in place. Obviously, there's a lot of administrative dilemmas. Resource and infrastructure. Again, I'm not going to read the list, but basically it's everything that we've just heard in the first Good News presentation applies here as well, right? It's about staffing and personnel, it's about training, education, recruitment, retaining people, cross-sector coordination, where do volunteers fit in? If you're going to talk about community partnerships and community engagement, how does that actually work? How do you set it up ahead of time? The mission and priorities are changing. I've mentioned the mission creep of the ADF and how they're responding or not responding to that. The mission is certainly broadening. And of course, comes down to the dollar and government allocations. We'll come back to that shortly. There are things that are happening on the greening justice front. We've mentioned decarbonisation right across the courts, corrections, policing, the regulatory sphere. But we can also talk about greening justice from the point of view of using technologies to give us a snapshot or an advanced picture through climate forecasting and climate literacy of potential hotspots where things might occur. And of course, issues of access, costs, capabilities, training, and staffing, again. There's issues of responding to crime. We have conventional crime that we have to respond to. We have crime that's going to be exacerbated by climate conditions. And we have new types of crimes, everything from carbon trading fraud to water theft, that are directly related to changing climates and situations. So we have to build capacity and expertise in these areas. In my mind, that requires specialization with many of our services, as well as collaboration across services. Responding to disaster and emergency, we need rapid response teams, policy and practice reviews. Yes, we have royal commissions into bushfires. Yes, we have standard operating reviews anytime a disaster occurs. But the question is, are we learning anything? And can we put into place what we've learned from those reviews? We can sometimes get top brass saying, hey, we've reviewed operations and you know, we'll do something different going forward. But we need to put that into standard operating procedures. We need to entrench the learnings from past disasters or similar types of disasters worldwide. Specially trained and educated leadership groups for me is a really big one. And without going on about it, the situational leadership needs to be worked at as well. They're combining services in a variety of places. The SCS with the police and other places, it's the fireys with the police, like in Tasmania, and not everybody's happy with these arrangements, but on the ground, who's going to make the decisions? And so we have to work out situational leadership. So, it's not looking good. And we have basically what I call the 3 S's. The speed of change. The speed of change. We just have to take this on board. It's happening so quickly. The scale of disaster. These are massive events. We know from 2020, where over 1 billion animals and creatures died, and the smoke circulated the planet. And that was from us. That was from our homes. And the scarcity of resources relating in particular to food and to fresh water. These are what we face today. And as I say here, billions of dollars need to be spent now to forestall the many more billions later. Strategic planning that prioritizes climate-related matters must be put into place now, as the fundamental mission is rapidly changing. Climate-related criminal justice initiatives are urgently needed across the spectrum of enforcement, adjudication, prevention, and corrections, and must be implemented now. For the future's already here. So this is not future planning, the future's here. And to be honest, there was a meeting in Canberra a few weeks ago where the federal government said, oh, we'll put together $400 million in advance of the fire season. $400 million is nothing. This is an emergency. This is a disaster. We need the money because our workforces need the money, and we're not going to have a workforce if we don't get the money. So this is a call for basically fund the disaster because if we don't, it's going to contribute to further disasters down the track. Thank you.